When students revise Macbeth, Duncan is often the one most people overlook. He dies early in the play, he does not have very many long speeches, and compared with Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, or the witches, he may not be seen particularly dramatic. But Duncan is absolutely essential to understanding the tragedy. In fact, one of the most important things to understand about Duncan is that his influence on the play becomes even greater after he dies. Through Duncan, Shakespeare explores kingship, loyalty, betrayal, and appearance versus reality. When Macbeth murders him, the consequences spread far beyond the death of one man. Scotland changes, nature changes, Macbeth changes, and the entire direction of the tragedy changes. So in this video, we are going to explore who Duncan is, what he represents, why his trusting nature is both a strength and a weakness, and how to write him at every level from a grade 3 to grade 9. By the end, you should understand why Duncan's important, and it's not measured by the number of scenes that he then appears in. Here is the central idea I want you to remember throughout this video. Shakespeare presents Duncan as a generous, legitimate, and respected ruler. But his murder is not simply the death of one man. Macbeth attacks several forms of order at the same time. First, Duncan is the rightful king. Macbeth does not have a legitimate claim to the throne, so killing Duncan is regicide, the murder of a monarch. Second, Duncan represents the natural order. After his death, Shakespeare fills the play with unnatural events. Darkness covers the daytime, horses become wild, the world itself seems disturbed. Third, Duncan represents political stability. Once he is gone, Scotland becomes a place of fear, suspicion, and tyranny. Finally, for many members of Shakespeare's Jacobean audience, the king had religious importance. A monarch was believed to be the ruler with God's authority. So Macbeth does not simply murder Duncan. Symbolically, he attacks the rightful, political, natural, and divine order of the world. However, we should not make Duncan too simple. He is not completely flawless. His greatest weakness is that he repeatedly fails to recognise deception, and in a play where appearances cannot be trusted, this becomes fatal. So let's begin with basic facts. Duncan is the rightful king of Scotland at the opening of the play. He is Macbeth's king. He is the father of Malcolm and Donal Blaine, and he is presented as generous and a trusting leader. Macbeth murders him in Act 2. But the most important question is not simply, what does Duncan do whilst he is alive? A better question is, what happens to the world of the play when Duncan is removed from it? Before his murder, Scotland had a recognised king. There had been rebellion, but it is defeated. Traitors are punished, loyal soldiers are rewarded, political order appears to be restored. After Duncan's murder, everything changes. Unnatural events disturb the world. Fear and suspicion spreads, political instability grows, Macbeth becomes a tyrant, and one murder leads to another and then another. So Duncan's importance is not measured by his stage time. He matters because his death changes the entire world of the play. Shakespeare gives Duncan several important dramatic purposes. First, he is the rightful king. He represents legitimate authority, the lawful and, according to Jacobean beliefs, divinely sanctioned right to rule. Second, he is a contrast to Macbeth. Duncan rewards loyalty and inspires genuine respect. Macbeth eventually rules through fear, suspicion, and murder. Third, Duncan is the victim of betrayal, and this is what makes his murder particularly shocking. Macbeth is not a stranger attacking an enemy. Duncan trusts him completely. Fourth, Duncan represents order. While he is alive, Scotland has a recognised political hierarchy. When Macbeth murders him and takes the crown, the order collapses. And finally, Duncan's murder sits at the centre of the tragedy. Think like a chain reaction. Regicide leads to guilt. Guilt contributes to further violence. Violence develops into tyranny. Tyranny creates more murder. And eventually Scotland descends into civil conflict. So Duncan may disappear from the stage early in the play, but almost everything that follows grows out of what happened to him. One of Duncan's clearest qualities is his generosity. When Macbeth and Banquo fight bravely for Scotland, Duncan rewards their loyalty. Macbeth receives the title Thane of Cawdor and tells Banquo, "I have begun to plant thee, and will labour to make thee full of growing." This is a brilliant quotation for analysis because Duncan's approach to leadership. The metaphor of planting makes Duncan seem almost like a gardener. A good gardener does not destroy healthy plants. They nurture them, they help them grow, and that is what Duncan appears to do with the loyalty of his subjects. The verb labour is also important. Labour means work or effort. So Duncan does not seem to view kingship as simply enjoying his stature and his privilege. He appears to recognise that leadership requires effort and responsibility. Now compare this with Macbeth. Duncan sees talented people and asks, "How can I help them grow?" Macbeth later sees talent and powerful people and asks, "How can they be a threat to me?" Duncan helps others flourish, whereas Macbeth destroys potential rivals. And that makes Duncan an important folly to Macbeth. By showing us Duncan's approach to power, Shakespeare makes Macbeth's later behaviour look more destructive. When Duncan greets Macbeth after the battle, he calls him, "O worthiest cousin." This is a short quotation, but you can analyse it almost at any grade level. At grade 3 or 4, you could simply explain that Duncan respects Macbeth and believes he is loyal. At grade 5 or 6, you may focus on worthiest. Duncan does not just call Macbeth worthy, he calls him worthiest. This suggests an extreme level of admiration. But now we can move higher. For grade 7 or 8, think about the dramatic irony. The audience already know that Macbeth has heard the witch's prophecies and has begun imagining the possibility of becoming king. Duncan sees a loyal hero. The audience sees the beginning of dangerous ambition. And for a grade 9, connect this to the theme of appearance versus reality. Macbeth appears brave, loyal, and trustworthy. But beneath that appearance, his desires are beginning to change. So Duncan's praise reveals two qualities at the same time. It shows his generosity, but it also exposes his vulnerability. He judges Macbeth by what he can see, and he cannot see what is growing underneath. To understand why Duncan's murder matters so much, we need some context. Many members of Shakespeare's Jacobean audience believe in the divine right of kings. This was the belief that kings received their authority from God. That meant king was far more than an ordinary political leader. Subjects were expected to obey him, and killing a monarch was considered an attack on both the state and God's order. The murder of a king is called regicide. So when Macbeth kills Duncan, Shakespeare's audience would not simply see one man murdering another. Macbeth attacks the monarchy, he attacks the political order, and according to the belief system, he attacks the order established by God. This makes Duncan's position essential to the tragedy. If Macbeth had murdered an ordinary man, the crime would still have been terrible. But Duncan is the rightful king. That gives the murder a much greater moral, political, and religious significance. And remember your exam technique here. Do not just write Jacobeans believed in the divine right of kings. Explain why that changes the meaning of Macbeth's crimes. Context should deepen your interpretation. The divine right of kings connects to another important Jacobean belief, which is the great chain of being. This is the idea that the universe has a fixed hierarchy. God was at the top, then came angels, kings, nobles, ordinary people, animals, and plants. Everyone and everything had a proper place. Duncan is the king. Macbeth is his subject. When Macbeth murders Duncan and takes his place, he violently breaks this hierarchy. And what happens after? Nature itself appears to become disturbed. Darkness covers the daytime. An owl kills a falcon. Duncan's horse becomes wild and are even said to eat one another. These events are not just included to make the place spooky. The natural world reflects the political crime. Think about an owl killing a falcon. A weaker bird is destroying a more powerful bird. The expected hierarchy is reversed. Just as Macbeth, the subject, has destroyed his king. So Shakespeare presents Duncan's murder as something that breaks that connection between king, country, and nature. Political disorder spreads into the entire world of the play. Now we reach a more complicated side of Duncan. He is generous. He is morally good. But is he a good judge of character? Not really. Before the play begins, the original Thane of Cawdor betrays him. Duncan says, "He was a gentleman on whom I built an absolute trust." Focus on the word absolute. This was not cautious trust. This was complete trust. And Cawdor betrayed him. Then Duncan gives Cawdor's title to Macbeth. And what does he do? He places enormous trust in Macbeth. Macbeth then betrays and murders him. So look at the pattern. The Thane of Cawdor is trusted. Cawdor betrays Duncan. Macbeth is then trusted. Macbeth then betrays Duncan. This creates an important question. Does Duncan learn from his mistakes? A higher level response should be able to hold these two ideas at once. Duncan's trust makes him admirable. It shows generosity and openness, but politically it makes him vulnerable. Shakespeare therefore presents trust as morally good but politically dangerous in a world dominated by deception. This is one of the best Duncan quotes in the entire play. After the first Thane of Cawdor betrays him, Duncan says, "There's no art to find the mind's construction in the face." In simple terms, Duncan means that you cannot look at someone's face and know what they are really thinking. Look at the contrast between mind and face. Our mind represents private thoughts. The face represents outward appearance. This connects directly to appearance versus reality. But the dramatic irony makes the moment even more powerful. Almost immediately after Duncan says this, Macbeth enters. The man who will murder him. Duncan understands the problem. He knows that people can hide their true thoughts, but he still cannot recognize deception when it is standing directly in front of him. This is what makes the moment tragic. For a grade 9 interpretation, you could argue that Duncan's statement becomes a warning for the entire play. In Macbeth, faces become performances. Characters hide ambition, guilt and violence behind carefully controlled appearances. Duncan knows deception exists. His tragedy is that he cannot detect it. When Duncan arrives at Macbeth's castle, he says, "This castle hath a pleasant seat." Banquo adds that the air is delicate. Think about how disturbing this is for the audience. Duncan sees a beautiful, welcoming place. The audience knows that it is a place where his murder is being planned. Duncan sees safety, the audience sees danger. Duncan sees hospitality, the audience sees betrayal. That creates the dramatic irony. But it also turns the castle itself into part of the theme of appearance versus reality. The building appears pleasant and safe on the outside. Inside, it conceals murderous intentions. And Macbeth's betrayal is especially serious because Duncan is connected to him in several ways. Duncan is his king, he is his relative, and now he is his guest. Also, Duncan's horse, Macbeth, should be the one to protect him. Instead, he uses the apparent safety of the home to make the murder possible. So the word pleasant becomes deeply ironic. Duncan unknowingly is admiring the palace and the place he will die. Shakespeare makes a deliberate structural choice not to show Duncan's murder. Macbeth enters the chamber, the audience waits, then Macbeth returns with the bloody daggers. Why? There are several possible reasons. First is suspense. The audience has to imagine what's happening behind that door. Sometimes what we imagine is more disturbing than what we actually see. Second, the offstage murders keeps the focus on Macbeth. We do not watch Duncan die. Instead, we watch what is killing Duncan and what this does psychologically to Macbeth. We see his guilt, his fear, and his mental collapse. Third, Shakespeare may preserve Duncan's dignity. The murder of a rightful king is not turned into a violent spectacle for entertainment. And finally, looking at the language used after his death, Macduff calls Duncan's body the Lord's anointed temple. A temple is a sacred place. The metaphor therefore makes Duncan's body seem holy, and anointed connects him to the idea of God's chosen and blessed by God. Symbolically, Macbeth has not simply killed a man, he has desecrated something sacred. One of the strongest ways to analyse Duncan is to compare him directly to Macbeth. Duncan is the rightful king, Macbeth is a usurper, someone who takes power illegally. Duncan rewards loyalty, Macbeth fears and destroys loyal people. Duncan inspires genuine respect. Macbeth creates fear and obedience. Duncan helps others grow. Macbeth destroys potential rivals. Duncan trusts the people around him. Macbeth eventually suspects almost everybody. And most importantly, Duncan represents order, while Macbeth represents chaos. This tells us something important about Shakespeare's presentation of kingship. A crown alone does not make someone a true king. Macbeth possesses the title, he sits on the throne, but he does not possess the moral qualities associated with legitimate leadership. You could reduce the contrast to two questions. Duncan asks, "How can I reward loyalty?" where Macbeth asks, "Who might threaten me?" That difference explains almost everything between the approaches of their power. Duncan's relationship with Macbeth gives us another useful example of kingship. Duncan tells Banquo, "I have begun to plant thee," and Banquo responds, "The harvest is your own." Notice how both characters use natural imagery. Duncan will plant Banquo, Banquo promises the harvest will belong to Duncan. This creates the image of a healthy relationship between ruler and subject. Duncan rewards loyalty, Banquo responds with continued service. The relationship is mutual, and the image of growth suggests stability and prosperity. Now compare this with Macbeth. Duncan sees Banquo's qualities, who wants to help and let him flourish. Macbeth sees these qualities as something to be afraid of. Eventually, Macbeth has him murdered. And why? Because the witches has predicted that Banquo's descendants will become king. Duncan is secure enough to allow other people to succeed. Macbeth sees the other people's success as a threat. So through Duncan and Banquo, Shakespeare presents legitimate kingship as a relationship built on mutual loyalty. Macbeth replaces that relationship with fear and violence. By now, we can see Duncan is more than an individual character. He represents several major ideas. First, legitimate kingship. Duncan has the lawful and divinely sanctioned right to rule. Everything Macbeth lacks. Second, Duncan represents order and stability. Whilst he is king, Scotland has a recognised hierarchy. His murder shatters that. Third, he represents generosity and trust. And this is where Shakespeare makes him interesting. His trust is both a virtue and a weakness. It makes him admirable, but it makes him vulnerable. And Macbeth, Duncan is central to appearance versus reality. He repeatedly fails to recognise betrayal hidden beneath his outward loyalty. But here's a grade 9 idea that I really want you to remember. Duncan becomes more powerful as a symbol after Macbeth kills him than when he was an active character. The worse Macbeth's rule becomes, the more vulnerable Duncan's lost Scotland appears. Macbeth can kill a man, but he cannot destroy what Duncan represents. Now let's turn this into an exam writing at a grade 3 or 4. Start with a clear point and a quotation. For example, Shakespeare presents Duncan as a kind and generous king. He calls Macbeth his worthiest cousin, showing that he respects and values him. This is clear and relevant. You could then focus on the superlative of worthiness and explain that it shows Duncan's complete admiration. Then add dramatic irony because the audience knows Macbeth is already beginning to consider betrayal. Moving towards a grade 7 and 8, you could argue that Duncan's misplaced trust develops appearance versus reality, and he recognises that there is no art to detecting hidden thoughts. He immediately fails to recognise Macbeth's ambition. And for a grade 9 argument, you may say, for example, Shakespeare presents Duncan as the moral and political atheist of Macbeth. Duncan's legitimate rule brings growth and order, while Macbeth's unlawful kingship produces fear and disorder. However, Duncan's repeated failure to recognise betrayal may suggest the moral goodness alone does not guarantee effective political judgment. Notice the difference. The highest level answer does not simply call Duncan good, it explores the complexity of what Shakespeare has created. And obviously, yes, this is not a complete paragraph, but you can see how it can build from just a very simple statement. Before you go, here are the 5 things you absolutely do need to remember about King Duncan. Number 1, Duncan is the rightful king. He is lawful and has divine authority, which gives Macbeth's crime its full moral, political and religious weight. Number 2, Duncan is generous and rewards loyalty. His imagery of planting and growth presents him as a ruler who helps others flourish. Number 3, his fatal weakness is trusting appearances. He repeatedly fails to recognise deception hidden beneath loyalty. Number 4, his murder breaks natural, political and divine order. After the regicide, Scotland and the natural world descends into chaos. And 5, Duncan contrasts sharply with Macbeth. His legitimate and generous kingship makes Macbeth's tyranny appear even more destructive and unnatural. So here is the ultimate grade 9 argument. King Duncan is not important because of how long he appears in the play. He is important because his murder transforms the tragedy. He becomes a symbol of legitimate kingship and moral order. And after his death, the chaos of Macbeth's rule makes Duncan's loss of Scotland appear increasingly vulnerable. That is why Duncan matters. Macbeth succeeds in killing the king, but he never succeeds in replacing what Duncan represents.